You're listening to Unmuted Love. Hi there, I'm C. Ushelman, and with 35 years as a marriage and family therapist and 25 years as a parent of 2 children I brought home from the foster care system, I want to welcome you here to Unmuted Love Podcast, the one place where nothing is off limits to say out loud about parenting children from difficult beginnings.
Stop for a minute, stop and breathe for a minute. Long it over your head, try to listen instead, won't you? Think for a minute, who you wanna be for a minute. Don't get over your head, you're like everyone else, aren't you?
Sometimes it's real sweet around here, and sometimes it ain't so pretty, because this is 100% Unmuted Love. So let's go.
You'll be just
Welcome everyone to Unmuted Love. I'm C, your host for today, and I am actually wanting to dig a little bit into grief. Fun, happy topic. Well, not really. Usually when I talk about grief, I'm focusing on the grief parents of children from difficult beginnings feel when they bring their children home and they find that their dreams related to adopting a child are not met by the reality. There's a lot of grief that comes with parenting a child who has been harmed by other people before you. And so your emotions are all over the place. Your excitement is great. Your anticipation is great. Your love is great. And also the grief is great. But today I'm going to broaden the conversation because I think we are experiencing a political wave across the world, regardless of what side of the aisle you fall on, that's triggering collective grief. There are some classic myths I want to bust and some ways of coping that just might help. Because just like when we were surviving the COVID pandemic, we are all in this world right now together. I want to start off by sharing with you a quote from E.A. Buccianeri, and the quote is simple, and it says this: "So it's true, when all is said and done, grief is the price we pay for love." And I really believe that. And when I'm talking about bringing a child home and you love that child, but the child has blocked trust, there's pain and grief involved in that. Just like when you're living in a country that you love or on a planet that you love, and what you were always hoping for, what you always believed would be true, seems to be falling apart before your very eyes. If you love it, you're going to feel grief. And so I want to talk to you about that because people keep coming into my office every day in the last few months, one person or another, telling me that they are overwhelmed with grief. They are overwhelmed with fear and grief and loss, and they have no idea what to do with it. People even ask me, what are you telling people when they come to you? What are you saying? Therapists are asking me, I don't know what to say. What do you say? And I say, it's grief. So let's talk about how to grieve what was until we can find a way out of it. Because grief has a story of its own. It has a life of its own. And it helps to know that. So I told you I was going to bust some myths. Myth number 1 is that grief is an emotion. Well, guess what? Grief and grieving are actually processes composed of many emotions, including the expected ones like sadness and surprising ones like anger, frustration, guilt, or even shock. Another feeling might be relief, while others might feel numb as though nothing has happened at all. All of these are normal. All of your feelings are going to be normal in a time of grieving. Some people even have joyful, grateful, hopeful feelings when a loved one passes or when a society changes because they're ready for the change and they're ready for the passing. Grieving is uniquely personal. That said, a 6-year study of grief, it was done in 2008, found that sometime after a loss, the most common experience is that of yearning. I love that word yearning, and I have experienced that during times of grief. And I actually find myself grieving a little bit here in this day and age. And the feeling that does come up often is yearning for peace, yearning for understanding, yearning for harmony, yearning for mutual understanding and empathy for all people. I'm yearning for it. So that is definitely coming up for me as one of the bigger emotions in grief. But grief itself is not an emotion. Myth number 2, grief is bad. Grief doesn't usually feel good, but researchers have determined that the grief process is healthy, and honoring grief will allow it room to transform into, a deeper acceptance of the loss. Grieving allows us to grapple with questions like, who am I? Who am I now? Who am I without this loved one? Who am I with this loved one? How would life be different? How can I best honor what's going on and not lose myself in the process? And myth number 3, more grief now is better. Well, the fact of that is that 10 to 20% of people follow a so-called recovery trajectory from grief after a loss. So after a loss, they may initially experience difficulty functioning and have intensely painful emotions. After a period of months, they gradually recover and return to their ordinary lives. But that's not actually the most common trajectory, which I was surprised to really find out, because around 50 to 60% of people who experience grief, they experience as a resilience trajectory where individuals are able to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of functioning, even in the immediate aftermath of a loss. And I think that's what people are doing right now. They're grieving, but they are moving forward. They are moving forward in resilience because that's what they're doing in order to live through to the other side. Myth number 4, the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. Now, you probably know the answer to that. Trying to ignore your pain or keeping it from surfacing will only make it worse in the long run. For real healing, it's necessary to face your grief and actively feel it. Anything you suppress is going to get bigger and it's going to come up some way or another. And you want it to come up as grief, not as deep depression. So it's really important to feel the feels and stay with them as long as they are present. Honor them until they move away on their own. And they won't move completely away on their own because grief is something that gets incorporated into who you are and gets processed and recorded in your identity so that you have a resilience that comes from grieving that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Myth number 5, it's important to be strong in the face of loss. Well, okay, maybe, but feeling sad, frightened, or lonely are normal reactions to loss. Crying doesn't mean you're weak. You don't need to protect your family or friends by putting on a brave front. Showing true feelings can help them and you. Having feelings is actually strong. So if you're having deep feelings right now during this world wave that we're experiencing, it's okay. It's okay. Feel the feelings. Let them move through you. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to pretend everything's going fine, and you don't have to ignore it either. There's a place for all of your feelings, and resilience would have you recovering while moving forward. Myth number 6, if you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss, or don't care about the lost person, or don't care about your country. Well, okay, but no. Crying is a normal response to sadness, but it's not the only one. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as others. They may simply have other ways of showing it. Also, I've noticed that a lot of people are coping with their grief by sticking their head in the sand, and that's what they have to do to keep moving forward. And while there might be a lot of finger pointing at people who are in the clouds about it or have their heads in the sand, hey, that's what they need to do in order to have their own mental health through these times of struggle. So be aware that people who are crying or people who aren't crying, people who are focusing on it, people who are not focusing on it, whatever you're doing because you need to, and that's okay. Honor it. And myth number 7, grieving should last about a year. There's no specific time frame for grieving. How long it takes differs from person to person. And when we're talking about this global experience, it's going to go on for some time, and we don't know when the end will be. And so there's going to be some kind of reckoning in terms of our acceptance, in terms of our moving forward, and in terms of our resilience. Also in terms of what we choose to do. Sometimes our resilience is going to take the form of fighting. Sometimes our resilience is going to take the form of self-care and healing ourselves and not worrying so much about the external. Wherever you are, however it's impacting you, that's exactly how you have to do it. And that's perfectly fine. And myth number 8, there's a right way to grieve. Well, okay, but no. This myth came out of the research of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you might recall, who postulated that grief has 5 distinct stages. I certainly learned this when I went to therapy school: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are the 5 distinct stages that she founded and published, wrote about, and became a very acceptable way of looking at grief. But she was actually studying the process of accepting one's own terminal diagnosis, not grieving the loss of someone else, grieving the loss of your hopes or your dreams, or grieving the loss of what was in your worldview. Grievers might skip stages, repeat stages, or even experience emotions not captured in the original 5. In reality, the grief process looks a lot less like a neat set of stages and a lot more like a roller coaster of varying emotions. Ride the wave, ride the emotions. That's all there is. And myth number 9, moving on with your life means forgetting about your loss. Well, no, moving on means you've accepted your loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. You can move on with your life and keep the memory of someone or something you lost as an important part of you. In fact, as we move through life, these memories can become more and more integral to defining the people we are. And so your memories of a loved one who's passed, your memories of what your hopes and dreams are, and your memories of the way the world was will inform the future, will inform how you become who you are over time and what you choose to do about it. Myth number 10, all people grieve the same because all people are the same. No, not really. There are many different ways to grieve. We may have some similar psychological responses to loss, like heartache or feeling out of sorts, or that yearning I was talking about earlier. There are many differences between and within cultures for the grieving process. There are cultural rituals and cultural rules that are more acceptable in one than in another. Families have rules and rituals too, and there are no right ways. It's okay to honor yourself, your culture, and the culture of the one lost. That's your human right. So it's okay to honor what you believe about your country or about the world. That is your human right too. So I want to say a little something about the difference between uncomplicated grief and complicated grief. So uncomplicated grief is what we tend to think of when we think of grief, right? Symptoms of depression or anxiety with poor sleep, lowered appetite, low mood, a sense of the loss as not quite being real at first, feeling disconnected from others, a kind of numbness maybe, guilt about not initially feeling pain about the loss, worries about not grieving normally, mood swings and tearfulness and distress, guilt about interactions with people, waves of sadness or anger which are overwhelming, seeking reminders of the person who has left or the rituals in our culture that are passing us by or leaving us for this time frame. There might be a lot of grief about that. Guilt about getting back to normal over time and at times forgetting to be sad or even forgetting to be outraged. So all of these things happen in uncomplicated grief. It's what most of us come to understand as grief. But complicated grief is different. Complicated grief is when you push away painful feelings or you avoid the grieving process entirely. Excessive avoidance of talking about or avoidance of reminders of people who have passed, situations that are sad, or the way things are going in our country or in the world, that is part of complicated grief. Refusal to attend any kind of support, using distracting tasks to avoid experiencing grief, including tasks associated with planning or doing something to make you feel better. Sometimes complicated grief lends itself to the use of alcohol or other drugs, including prescription drugs. Increased physical complaints or illness pop up during complicated grief, intense mood swings or isolation, which don't resolve within 1 or 2 months, ongoing neglect of self-care and responsibilities. Complicated grief can be deadly. So pay attention to your grief, won't you? Pay attention to how hard all of this change is hitting you, because you deserve to be listened to and heard and seen, even though no one really has a great answer perhaps for how to make it different, how to accept, how to be resilient. Listening, being heard, being seen, all those things are really important to uncomplicating your grief. So I want to say just a few tips for grieving. How long is it supposed to take? Listen, try not to put limits on your grief. While grief doesn't usually lessen with time, how quickly or slowly is unique to each person. Accept your humanness and the grief process. Resist comparing your grief to other people's. So Instagram and Facebook are not your friends when it comes to grieving. They are also not your friends when you are paying attention to what's happening in your country or in the world, because there are so many mixed messages. There's so much going on in social media that you can be whiplashed, whipped back and forth emotionally until you just feel like you can't think. That is not a good way to deal with your grief. So try to remove yourself from social media. Make a pact with yourself to only look at social media a particular time of day for a particular amount of time. 30 minutes would be a long time. Or maybe once a week you watch a show on the news for an hour that you like, that you feel you can trust, that will inform you about what happened in the week. That way you don't have to watch the news day in and day out to keep you up on things, because it's not necessary. And it also is depressing to do that. So that's the best tip for managing media and managing your awareness. Yes, you want to be aware. I get that. But adding to your grief, complicating your grief, will not be helpful to you or anyone else. Another thing you can do is spend time grieving intentionally. Give yourself the time to feel these feelings. Carve out time to cry, scream, reflect, or honor your experience, right? What you resist persists. So build something sacred, beautiful, cultural to honor the reality of what's going on, to give you something sacred to be putting your dreams in, your hopes, your aspirations, and sending them out into the universe. What that is will be up to you and your personal, cultural, familial ways. Whatever you choose will be just right. And seeking out the right kind of social support. It's fine to seek out people to talk about your grief to. However, you don't have to always be talking about your grief to get out of isolation and be with other people. Go hit some golf balls with a friend. Catch a cup of coffee with a next door neighbor who hasn't a clue what's going on in the world. Great. You can talk about planting your garden for the spring. Go back to the book club and read a book that's frivolous and something enjoyable. It's okay to get out. It can be very healing. Try not to isolate alone without social support, but also don't put yourself in the position of being bombarded by people who are as despondent as you are. That will make it worse, not better. So yes, camaraderie helps. Yes, a little bit of connection with somebody who sees things your way, sure, that will help. But a lot of time commiserating with someone in a negative way will not turn out very well for your grieving process. And there's more to grief than sadness. Sadness can be a big part of grieving, but so is happy, joyful, angry, disappointed, afraid, relief, anxiety, and yearning. Those who manage healthy grieving are those who embrace the full range of emotions with compassion and understanding for themselves and for others going through it. So have compassion for the people who are grieving, or have compassion for the people who aren't grieving. Have compassion for yourself, because that's what matters in the long run. And then lastly, I want you to take your self-care seriously during this time. You are a very important person in your life and the lives of others, especially if you're raising children from difficult beginnings. Your life was already complicated, and now the world has complicated just a little bit more. You know the drill, right? Eat healthy foods, drink a lot of water, don't drink too much or do drugs, exercise reasonably, and be active, even if only on a small walk each day. Get good rest, sleep, and socialize with happy people. That will help you the most. So that's really all I want to say about grief today. I know this is a departure from my usual kind of conversation with you, but I'm just feeling pretty heavy, not so much with my own grief, but with holding the grief of others. I have never experienced in my 37 years as a therapist this much grief in other people. It's pretty much on an hour-to-hour basis in my office, and I literally have to shake off the distress and the stress, and I have to use neurohacks on an hourly basis so that I don't fill up with stress and grief from everybody's grieving process. And that might be happening to you too. So shake it off, hug it out, talk it out, go do something fun. It's okay to be happy even when you feel sad about something that is passing right before your eyes, because that's perfectly human. Thank you again for joining me here for Unmuted Love, where nothing is off limits. Take care now, and I'll see you in the next episode. Hey parents, this is C. Get the help you need to end destructive and chaotic behavior in your home while parenting children from difficult beginnings. I know you need help, and the Love Plus parenting model actually works. I'm inviting you to work with me personally for 6 months in my virtual therapeutic parent program, and I guarantee you results or 100% of your investment back. How is that for a blue ribbon deal? I'm looking forward to working with you. See you on the inside.
Stop for a minute. Stop and breathe for a minute. Long it over your head. Try to listen instead, won't you? Think for a minute. Who you wanna be for a minute. Don't get over your head. You're like everyone else, aren't you? You could gain from being a bit nicer. Knowing to talk and when to shut your mouth.
The Unmuted Love podcast is hosted by me, C. Eshelman, attachment and trauma specialist at the Attach Place in Sacramento, California. Our podcast producer is the amazing Saya Clark, and our theme song is Nicer by Houses on the Hill, licensed through Epidemic Sound. Thank you for being such loyal listeners here on Unmuted Love. I'll see you all next week.
You'll be just fine.